What if the path to peace in Ukraine isn't through more diplomatic promises, but a clear-eyed look at raw power and, frankly, unwavering accountability? The world recently watched some really high-stakes diplomatic moves, all centered on the conflict in Ukraine. Just days ago, we had the 2025 Russia-United States summit up in Alaska. President Trump met face-to-face with Vladimir Putin there. And this wasn't just a routine meeting. It came after weeks of really quite unnerving nuclear tensions. Remember that stark warning from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, that was July 31st, mentioning the dead hand threat.
Right. The dead hand, for anyone who doesn't know, is this old Soviet-era automatic nuclear launch system. Terrifying idea. Really designed to hit back even if their command structure is gone.
Exactly. And Trump's response. The very next day, August 1st, he announced he was moving 2 nuclear submarines toward Russia.
And that wasn't all. On August 4th, Russia declared it wasn't bound anymore by that key 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF.
Which the U.S. had already left back in 2019, it's worth remembering. But the tension, you could feel it. There were even sightings of that nuke sniffer plane, the WC-135R Constant Phoenix.
Yeah, that plane's basically a flying lab designed to detect radioactive stuff in the air. Seeing it near Russia's Kola Peninsula, well, it definitely hinted they might be testing that nuclear-powered cruise missile, the Burevestnik.
These were not subtle moves on the world stage.
Not at all.
Then, right after Alaska, President Trump hosted Ukrainian President Zelensky at the White House. This was August 18th, and European and NATO leaders were there too. So our mission today really is to cut through the headlines, the spin, and just unpack these critical meetings. We want to understand what was actually proposed, and maybe more importantly, look at the realistic options for ending this war.
Because the cost keeps going up, right? For American taxpayers, for global stability, it affects you, our listener, directly.
Absolutely. And to help us sort through all this,
we've got quite a bit to draw on. Recent Wikipedia updates covering the summits and peace talks, some deep analysis from the Atlantic Council. They're a major foreign policy think tank, and also a detailed assessment from CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, specifically looking at U.S. aid to Ukraine.
So we're trying to get to the core of it to help you really understand the stark realities here.
Exactly.
Okay, let's dive in. That Alaska summit between Trump and Putin, sources said it ended with, quote, vague promises of progress, but no formal ceasefire agreement. Given that backdrop of nuclear posturing you mentioned, that sounds, well, not like a breakthrough.
No, it wasn't. It was really fraught. Those public statements about the INF treaty, the potential weapon tests, that wasn't just talk. It felt like a real shift back to a more volatile kind of great power competition.
So the lack of a ceasefire agreement just highlights how far apart they still are.
Precisely. It showed the deep distrust. When that trust disappears between nuclear powers, even basic agreements are incredibly hard to reach. And meanwhile, the conflict just grinds on.
And President Trump's approach, his style, definitely played into this. He's always been very direct. He clearly stated the war, quote, would have never happened if he'd been president earlier.
Right, and he also claimed he'd ended 6 wars before. Now, some of those were more like temporary ceasefires, but it does show his consistent focus on direct talks, often outside the usual channels, to just stop the fighting.
His stated goal for Ukraine was pretty blunt. Only here to stop it, not to prosecute it any further.
Very result-focused.
Yeah, but that direct, maybe almost transactional approach clashes hard with the very specific, deeply rooted demands from both sides. Russia's peace offer, Putin's offer, it's extensive.
What does it include?
Well, barring Ukraine from ever joining NATO, full stop, recognizing Russia's annexation of Crimea, lifting certain sanctions, making Russian an official language in parts of Ukraine, and making sure the Russian Orthodox Church can operate freely there.
Wow, that's not just tweaking things. It's demanding Ukraine fundamentally change its identity and foreign policy. Exactly. It's basically rewriting Ukraine's sovereignty on Russia's terms.
But Ukraine's position under Zelensky is just as firm, right? Based on their own sovereignty.
Absolutely. He's been emphatic. Russia must end this war, which it itself started, and he's made it crystal clear they won't give up Crimea or other territories Russia occupies. He sees that as violating their constitution.
So it's a fundamental clash over national integrity, international law, not just negotiating points.
Definitely. And amidst all this high-level geopolitics, there was that interesting humanitarian angle. First Lady Melania Trump sent a personal letter to Putin during the Alaska summit.
What did it say?
It urged him to protect the innocence of children affected by the war. She asked him to restore the melodic laughter of children. It was quite poignant, especially when you consider the UN reports.
What were those reports saying?
Over 700,000 children displaced inside Ukraine, another 1.7 million becoming refugees. And then you have the International Criminal Court, the ICC, accusing Putin himself of war crimes related to abducting Ukrainian children.
It's just a heartbreaking reminder of the human cost behind the strategy and the politics.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this brings us to a really key point. This idea of security guarantees versus, well, hard power. There's been talk for months about a coalition of the willing, maybe a European reassurance force to monitor a ceasefire. But the Atlantic Council says this whole effort is shrouded in ambiguity. What does that really mean? Is it just talk?
It means the details are fuzzy and the commitment is questionable. The Atlantic Council is blunt. They say Western governments would almost certainly not go to war with Russia for Ukraine.
Wow. They actually said that.
They did. They called anyone arguing otherwise dangerously delusional. Their point is that written promises are, quote, hopelessly naive for stopping someone like Putin if he's determined.
So the risk for Western powers is just too high compared to the promise on paper.
That seems to be the core calculation, yes. The immense costs, the geopolitical dangers of direct conflict with Russia, they consistently outweigh the perceived obligation of a security guarantee. It exposes that gap between diplomatic language and real commitment.
And we have seen this before, right? It's not just theoretical. The Budapest Memorandum in 1994.
Exactly, a binding treaty. Russia, the U.S., the U.K. guaranteed Ukraine's borders when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons.
But when Russia actually violated those borders.
The promise was just to refer the matter to the UN Security Council, which, given Russia's veto power there, was, well, effectively meaningless.
It really shows how easily guarantees can evaporate without the political will and the actual power to back them up.
Which is why the Atlantic Council says, unequivocally, a strong Ukraine is the only realistic security guarantee against Russia.
So forget the paper promises. Focus on making Ukraine itself strong enough to deter attack.
That's the argument. It means a serious, dramatic increase in weapons and equipment supplies. And critically, investing heavily in Ukraine's own defense industry.
Making Ukraine not just a recipient of aid, but a core part of European defense.
Europe's frontline defender and the arsenal of the continent, is how they put it. A self-sustaining security pillar.
And Ukraine has shown incredible grit here. They produced nearly 2 million drones in 2024 alone.
Yeah, and their artillery and mortar shell production jumped 150% between 2023 and 2024, hitting 2.5 million rounds a year. That's a massive ramp up.
But it raises the question of dependence, especially on U.S. aid. Is that reliance a potential vulnerability? A double-edged sword?
Oh, absolutely. The CSIS analysis we looked at suggests that a complete cutoff of U.S. military and intelligence aid would significantly harm Ukraine, but importantly, it would not necessarily lead to immediate defeat.
Okay, so not an instant collapse, but still very damaging. What's the key dependency then?
Intelligence. U.S. support in signals intelligence, imagery, human intelligence, it's described as pivotal for their precision strikes. You can have the weapon, but you need to know exactly where to aim it.
So without U.S. intel, their advanced weapons become much less effective.
Pretty much. There's a U.S.-led fusion center in Germany feeding Ukraine daily target data. It speeds up their targeting dramatically. This intel was key in battles like Severodonetsk in 2022 and Kyiv in 2024.
The report literally says they cannot destroy what they cannot locate.
Exactly. And beyond targeting, U.S. aid covers military planning, logistics, long-term training. It's deeply woven into their operations. A cutoff is way more complicated than just stopping weapon shipment.
Which brings us to Europe's role. They've trained a lot of troops, over 70,000, actually more than the U.S. in that specific area. But can Europe really fill the gap if U.S. support drops significantly?
The sources suggest no, not really. Europe cannot replace U.S. support in several areas. Their defense industrial base just isn't on a war footing.
What are the problems there?
Systemic issues. Supply chains are described as poorly designed, sometimes due to old national protectionist habits. Lack of standardization between countries. Companies don't collaborate well across borders. It makes scaling up production really hard.
And they lack some key U.S. systems.
Right. They don't really have equivalents for things like HIMARS or ADAS-EMS, the long-range precision rockets that have made such a difference. And the U.S. Patriot system is still the only NATO system that can defend against Russian ballistic missile attacks. Europe doesn't have that capability at scale.
So it's structural limitations, not just maybe a lack of will. This feeds into a sentiment you hear more and more in the U.S., doesn't it? That question often seen online.
Yeah, the one that goes something like 500 million Europeans asking 300 million Americans to protect them from 100 million Russians. Why can't the Europeans take ownership? It points to this perception, growing perhaps, that Europe hasn't fully stepped up.
And U.S. public opinion reflects that shift, too. Support for arming Ukraine dipped between May and October 2023 from 46% down to 41%. People are starting to question the cost, the duration.
Meanwhile, Ukraine is doing a lot domestically. Their defense industry produces 30% of their own weapons now, employs 300,000 people and 500 companies. That's drones, tanks, ammo. Pretty impressive under wartime conditions.
They face huge challenges there, too.
Absolutely. Russia actively targets those factories. Motor Sich and Antonov, key companies, suffered over $600 million in damage between 2022 and 2024. And they still rely on foreign parts, like from China, for drones, which create supply chain risks.
And it's not just military stuff. Even the UN faced issues relying on Russian and Ukrainian civilian air transport for peacekeeping, right? They had to ground Russian planes over safety concerns.
Yeah, it just highlights how fragile reliance on external sources can be, especially when those sources are involved in conflict or become unreliable for other reasons.
So connecting all these dots, the future looks pretty uncertain. If U.S. aid were cut significantly, what would happen?
Well, the strategic initiative would likely shift to Russia. It could embolden Moscow and its allies, think China, North Korea, Iran. We already know North Korea sent around 15,000 troops to help Russia and took nearly 5,000 casualties doing it. That's a real commitment.
And while Ukraine innovates with drones and software, that's hard to sustain against a bigger enemy without steady support.
It's incredibly difficult and unpredictable, yes.
Okay, so what does a realistic path forward look like? If paper guarantees are weak and direct intervention is unlikely, what kind of security guarantee could actually work for Ukraine?
Experts suggest a few things. First, any credible guarantee probably shouldn't include Russia or China as guarantors. It needs nations that have both the military capability and the political credibility to actually step in.
And it needs teeth, right? Not just words.
Exactly. It should demand an automatic reimposition of sanctions within days of an attack, no dithering. And the guarantors must be ready for a full range of responses, potentially including military support or even direct action.
And this would be a bridge until
Ukraine can integrate into a stronger collective security structure like the European Union. The EU's Article 42 Delov already has a mutual defense clause, pledging aid and assistance if a member is attacked. That integration offers more durable protection.
So, as Ukraine weighs this incredibly tough choice, keep fighting or accept a peace deal that might mean losing territory. Maybe here's a final thought for you, our listener. In a world where diplomatic promises often ring hollow and the will for direct intervention seems limited, where does Ukraine's real security lie? Is it in external guarantees, however well structured? Or is it ultimately in becoming so strong militarily, so self-sufficient, that challenging its sovereignty becomes unthinkable for any adversary? Internal strength versus external reliance.